Hello, everyone. Good to see you, or at least be seen by you. I want to welcome everybody to today's Elder Abuse Awareness, Where Do You Fit In series. This is our first of 3 webinars. My name is Byron Cordes. I am a social worker here in San Antonio and the current president of our Adult Protective Services, South Texas Adult Protective Services Community Board. And I just want to thank everybody for attending. Looks like we have almost 30 folks on here. This is great, from kind of all over South Texas. I want to welcome you again. I want to say thanks to our committee. I also want to say thanks to our sponsors. We have the Alamo Area Council of Governments, our local board, the San Antonio Bar Association, the Elder Law Section, and of course, Texas Department of Family and Protective Services Legal Services. So this month, October, is Financial Exploitation Awareness Month, and the state of Texas works during this month to raise awareness about ways that we can help prevent, recognize, and report elder financial exploitation. And our South Texas APS Community Board is happy to join forces with APS to put a spotlight on stopping financial exploitation and other important issues during October. So before we get started, I do want to kind of go over a few housekeeping rules so you know how to participate in today's event. All of you are in listen-only mode right now, and you've been muted. If you've called into the webinar, you should also be muted, but you may want to make sure your phone is muted and not put us on hold, because I guess we'd hear your hold music unless it's really good. So to interact during the webinar, on your kind of dashboard, you should have a questions bar, a questions pane, and you can just submit questions there. And we have Daryl Greer and Carol Birch, both on our committee, who are kind of monitoring those questions throughout. If any groundbreaking questions come in, they can try and interrupt Lisa. Otherwise, we're going to save all the questions to the very end. Our goal is to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. That's the whole point of today. And so if we don't get to your question today, we're going to work pretty hard to get you a response after the webinar. So with that, you'll also, by the way, you'll get a follow-up email. It should come in tomorrow, and you'll get a short evaluation, and you will, it'll also have the CLE number on it, which we'll give you at the end of today's session. You can download today's slides in the handout section also, by the way, in your kind of control panel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the incomparable Lisa Diven Brown. She is the Adult Protective Services Regional Attorney. And Lisa, I don't know how long you've been doing this, probably since I've known you. You must have started when you were 12.
In 2011, in fact, and I was more than 12.
Okay, so for almost 10 years. And today she's going to talk to us about adult protective services and ethical duties of attorneys. So I will go away and hand it over to you, Lisa. Thank you.
All right, and I believe you should be able to see my screen. Like Byron said, I'm Lisa Brown. I've been with Adult Protective Services since 2011. I am the regional attorney here in South Texas, so my area covers kind of New Braunfels, San Antonio, over to Del Rio, and then the other way over towards Victoria and down through the south, through the valley. I did want to make sure to thank the board for putting on this presentation and for organizing this series. We do have two more presentations coming up in this series, and I think both of them will be amazing, perhaps better than this one. But this is the one that has ethics, so I win on that. All right, and I also wanted to make sure to thank the Community Engagement Department of Adult Protective Services and Department of Family and Protective Services. They put together most of this presentation, the nuts and bolts of it, and I just added in the legal parts of it. So the fact that it is beautiful and looks well organized is mostly due to that department. So thank you very much. Lawyers, right? So we need disclaimers. There's nothing I'm saying today is legal advice. Also, as you can see, I am coming to you from my house. So the department does not endorse Star Wars. My husband does. I share a space with him. All right. So let's go on ahead and see. Oh, there's me. And these are, the slides are available as a handout in your handout pane. So you'll have my contact information there. This is my cell phone, so this is where I'm available during the pandemic, and email is usually the best way to reach me. All right. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about Adult Protective Services, let you know what we are, and as we'll discuss later, we are a mandatory reporting state. So we're going to talk about the ethical duties we have as attorneys and also the legal responsibility we have to report. But before we can get into that, we have to know, what does APS do? So when do I know when to report to them? All right, so the mission statement of APS is to protect people ages 65 and older and adults ages 18 to 64 with disabilities from abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation by investigating and by providing or arranging for services necessary to alleviate or prevent future maltreatment. And there's our webpage there where you can always get more information. So a little bit of background, facts and figures. In fiscal year 2019, APS in-home investigations received 118,717 reports. Of those, only 528 were classified as coming from legal or the courts. So this is a real area of opportunity. I know that those of us who are attorneys and judges are really do see a lot. And as we go into that, I do have a poll, which I was supposed to do earlier, but I forgot. So just to know where everyone's coming from, what is your role within the legal system? Or are you not in the legal system? Do you work with elderly? So if y'all could please answer that poll, just so we can know who is on the call today and who's listening, and hopefully tailor the conversation to what your needs are. And I'm just giving a few minutes for those responses to come in. Okay, and we have about 76% of people reporting. So see if I did that correct. All right, there we go, and it is way too small for me to read. But we can see that most of y'all are attorneys or work with the elderly or individuals or some other role. So thank you very much for letting us know. All right. All right. So, so those of us who are in the legal field, who are attorneys, this is really an opportunity because we do get a lot of information on our clients and what's going on with their lives. And we are in a unique position to be able to see those possible issues of abuse, neglect, and exploitation, and hopefully report them early on before they can cause large problems for our clients and for our vulnerable adults. So of those APS intake reports, just over 50,000 of them resulted in some finding of abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And of those, 18,000 were alleged perpetrators were investigated, and just over 4,000 of the valid allegations had perpetrators. So what we're seeing here is that most of the investigations that APS conducts are self-neglect. There is not an alleged perpetrator. And as we all know, this is an increasingly large issue in our society. We have 3.5 million older residents in Texas. Almost half of all elderly individuals nationwide have a disability, and 1.7 million adults have a disability in Texas. That comes out to nearly 1 out of 7 people. So we do have lots of vulnerable adults that could be susceptible to abuse, neglect, or exploitation. All right, and these are the statutes that we deal with all the time. Human Resources Code Chapter 48 is what I largely work with Adult Protective Services, and then the associated administrative code sections are in Chapter 705. And I had never heard about it before I applied for APS, so it is kind of an obscure place, and I had never even heard of the Human Resources Code. So that's where we're located. And the people that we serve, we're looking at individuals over the age of 65. Now, I did not set that definition, the legislature did. I will tell you that in APS, we're not, kind of a unique thing about working with this population is we're not going to look at somebody and call them old until they are probably at least 80 is going to be respectable. I regularly say, oh, someone's 67, they're super young. So I didn't set this definition as to who is elderly, so don't blame me, but do know that if you do fall in this category, APS is not going to call you old. We're going to be impressed with you and call you young if you are below probably 70. All right, we also do serve individuals with disabilities, so individuals who are 18 years and older who have a mental, physical, or developmental disability that substantially impairs that person's ability to provide adequately for their care or protection. All right, so this substantial impairment, I'm not going to read this whole slide to you because you can read yourselves, but it's looking at the individual's ability to function and to provide self-care. So it's not just an ability to work. We're looking at the whole picture of what's going on with that person. You do not have to make a determination as to whether or not an individual has a substantial impairment before you call in a report. Just if you have some suspicion, APS will go out and we will do an assessment to determine if they are eligible for APS services. So just so you know, that's what we're looking at. Some of the activity limitations we're looking for: shopping, cooking, general activities of daily living. Dressing in clothing that's appropriate for the weather. So one of the kind of common red flags we'll see in our APS clients is that they'll be wearing really warm clothing, layers and layers of clothes when it is really hot outside. They also may have difficulty obtaining needed medical services, transportation, provider. They're just generally not able to protect themselves. All right, so what do we actually investigate? Because the first part of APS is the investigation to see if the abuse, neglect, or exploitation is happening. And then if there is, then we would put in services or attempt to put in services to remedy that issue or to reduce the risk of future harm. So when we're looking at abuse, we're looking at the negligent or willful infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or cruel punishment resulting in physical or emotional harm or pain. All right, and we are also looking at somebody who is a caretaker, family member, or another individual with an ongoing relationship with that person. APS really wants, the legislature has set us up to really focus on individuals who have an ongoing relationship with our clients, with our alleged victims, and not somebody who kind of comes in and is an unknown person on the street or an unknown scamster, because we want to look at those individuals who have a close relationship because we're better able to remedy those situations, and our vulnerable adults are more vulnerable to people who have that ongoing relationship. If it's somebody without an ongoing relationship, that is much more likely to be a criminal matter and handled by law enforcement. So indicators that we look for are bruises, burns, unexplained injuries, if somebody has been pushed or shoved. With our elderly, that need assistance with the bathing, with the changing. People use caretakers using unnecessary force to do that, or being forced to place their limbs in unnatural or painful positions. Other things we might see are fear of the perpetrator, low self-esteem, depression. These are all red flags of abuse and things that you might see in individuals as you're interacting with them in your practice. Often the alleged perpetrators also may threaten harm. They may be intimidating the vulnerable adult. Okay, and the next thing that we're looking at is sexual abuse. This is fairly standard, and the APS definitions specifically reference the penal code definition, so we're looking at any kind of non-consensual sexual activity. And I do want to say that the difference between the APS investigation and a law enforcement investigation is APS is looking at a preponderance of the evidence, so it's a civil standard, it's much lower. We do cooperate with law enforcement and share information with them as necessary, make reports necessary, but it is not the same standard of evidence. All right. Other indicators of sexual abuse, we're looking at individuals who might have a sexually transmitted disease or infection, an unexplained pregnancy, unexplained bleeding, bruising, or other injuries. All right, neglect. And this is what comprises the vast majority of what APS investigates in the field. So neglect, we define that as the failure to provide for oneself the goods or services which are necessary to avoid physical or emotional harm or pain, or the failure of a caretaker to provide such goods or services. And neglect can range from something very simple like all right, somebody who just needs a little bit of help. Maybe you've seen somebody in your practice and you can tell they're getting confused. You're thinking, boy, they could sure use a provider. Somebody who needs a provider is probably neglecting themselves. This is not the same thing as CPS, where there is an alleged perpetrator in every single case and there's some kind of malfeasance implied with a finding. APS findings of validation, particularly self-neglect validations, it just means that somebody needs some assistance. So they may be over or under medicating, and they may need some assistance getting a pill box set up. They may be unable to bathe. There may be unsafe or unsanitary living conditions. They may need some medical equipment. Often neglect, or individuals who are self-neglecting, they can be embarrassed. They can be fearful, because one of the things, the misconceptions about adult protective services is that we just come in and take people out and put them in nursing homes, right? APS wants all their money, so they just want to put somebody in a nursing home. So that's something that you can seek to clarify with your clients. APS's goal is to keep somebody in place. We'll talk about services here in a little bit, but our goal is not to place somebody in a nursing home, and we do not get any additional funding if we do place somebody in a nursing home. Other things you might see, some disorientation, confusion, agitation, contrary statements. A lot of times individuals are afraid to get their family in trouble, right? If they've got a child who's their caretaker, they're afraid if they say, I need a little bit more help, that could get their child, who's taking very good care, you know, as good of care as they can of them, in trouble, or that person might get mad that they reported and said they needed more assistance and leave, and that individual would lose that source of support. All right, our next allegation is exploitation. So exploitation is defined as the illegal or improper act or process of a caretaker or another individual with an ongoing relationship with the elderly person or person with a disability, using their resources for profit or gain without the informed consent of the individual. All right, so things that you'll see, possible red flags of financial exploitation, the impact. These individuals may not be able to pay their bills, right? If they're giving all their money or somebody's taking all of their money, then they're not able to pay for their rent, for their utilities. They might lose independence because they're not able to pay for transportation or other things that they were previously able to afford. As attorneys, one of the things that we sometimes see are multiple powers of attorney. You've got a child who comes in and says, my mother has signed 3 powers of attorney in the past 6 months. That's a big red flag. There's obviously something going on there why we've got so many powers of attorney. And if you see somebody that's got that kind of issue, please call it into APS so we can investigate, see what's going on. There may be an issue there, there may not, but that is something to call us in. Particularly with our elderly clients, they're unable to replace those lost assets through unemployment the way that younger working individuals can do. And then if they've lost all their resources, they may be unable to hire an attorney to pursue legal protections and remedies. So it can be really disastrous to our elderly and vulnerable adults when they're victims of exploitation. Other indicators we see sudden changes in the bank account or banking practice. A lot of times when the perpetrators move in, you'll have seen somebody acting very frugally, and then all of a sudden they have a new girlfriend or a new boyfriend, and they're buying this beautiful house when they've always lived in a very small, modest home. You might also see unexplained withdrawals of a lot of money by a person accompanying the alleged victim. You see ATM withdrawals a lot. A lot of times the perpetrators will get those ATM cards and just start pulling out cash, sometimes on a very regular basis. We'll also see unexplained missing funds or valuables. The other things we see, sometimes they get substandard care. If you've got a client, you can see that they have plenty of assets and they should be able to have a very nice place, but they're telling you they can't afford the rent. That's a big indicator. The sudden appearance of somebody who's uninvolved previously, that can be a great red flag. They can come in asking to change some estate documents, and maybe your alleged victim has had an estate plan in place for a long time, and then all of a sudden they're wanting to change it after having that in place for several years. That's something that we might look at as a red flag that that person is potentially exploiting your alleged victim. Sometimes you see unnecessary services. That's kind of one of those gray areas where it kind of sometimes those commercial relationships can turn into ongoing relationships. So if you have an individual who maybe hires a contractor once, and that individual, the contractor, overcharges your vulnerable adult, that may not be exploitation. That may be some kind of criminal issue that needs to be investigated. But if that handyman, that contractor, just comes over and over and says, oh no, I'm going to help you out, they suddenly are on a power of attorney, they're helping with the bills, and then they're doing tons of repairs to the home, perhaps of substandard quality, and for just outrageous fees, those kind of things might veer into the range of exploitation. And again, these are things that you might see that the perpetrator's doing. They often try to isolate their victim from family members and friends, cutting down on visits, that kind of thing. Often the perpetrators, you'll see some anger or some indifference towards the client. Just something that you wouldn't expect. You look at that relationship between maybe a vulnerable adult and their child or whoever has come in with them, and it just doesn't feel right. Go ahead and call that in. You never know what's going on. If there's a history of substance abuse, mental illness, criminal behavior, or family violence, that's something that can frequently lead to abuse, neglect, or exploitation of the vulnerable adults. Those kind of stresses on the family can cause issues. You'll also see conflicting accounts of incidents. Sometimes as you ask questions, the things change. All of a sudden there's new explanations for why something happens. Showing more concern for the inheritance than for the client. That's something that as lawyers, we see that more often than a lot of other people, whereas APS will not necessarily, we're not going to investigate what the will says, but if you see somebody who is just concerned with, what am I going to inherit? I've already got it, so I might as well take it now. That's my inheritance. I'll have it someday, but I need it now. Those are red flags about exploitation, and that is something that we hear fairly frequently from our perpetrators is, it's mine, I'm going to inherit it anyway, so I might as well take it now. And that is not correct. That is not their inheritance until our client passes away, and they can always change their minds. So that is one of the things that we see very frequently and that you may see in your practice. They'll also sometimes blame the client for their actions, particularly as our elderly clients and clients with disabilities, as their illnesses take away their ability to make decisions and to control their behaviors. It's very easy for alleged perpetrators to say that that's something that the victim is doing, not something that their illness is doing. So that can be an indicator of potential abuse. And then obviously we've seen flirtation, coyness, possible indicators of an inappropriate sexual relationship. All right, so how does this actually work in process? All right, as I've said before, APS investigates self-neglect allegations and then also allegations against paid caretakers, unpaid caretakers, family members, and individuals with a relationship with the alleged victim. Now, we investigate in homes, in private homes, in adult foster homes, if they're not a foster care provider, in unlicensed board and care homes. Those are homes with 3 or fewer individuals living in a home. There are investigations done in nursing homes and hospitals, but that is not APS. If you don't know where to report those, you can always call our statewide intake, and they will refer you to the appropriate agency. It's often easier to remember to call APS. We have the same reporting as Child Protective Services. All those calls go through our statewide intake, and they can lead you to the right place if you don't know where to go. That's our hotline right there. You can either call the phone number. Again, we do share a hotline with Child Protective Services. You can also make a report online if it's not something that needs to be addressed immediately. Those are checked within 24 hours. So the mechanics of how that works is you call in, we have a statewide intake hotline that will gather information about what the allegations are, and then they will relay that information to the field if it's appropriate for investigation. And then the APS specialist in the field will make a case initiation within 24 hours of receiving that intake, where they'll call you as the reporter or somebody else with current and reliable information on the client to find out what's going on and to gather as much information as possible and start the investigation. All right, who is required to report? Any person 18 years or older who suspects that a vulnerable adult is in a state of abuse, neglect, or exploitation shall immediately report that information to APS. That's the Human Resources Code 48.051. And it does specify that that duty to report applies without exception to a person whose knowledge concerning the possible abuse, neglect, or exploitation is obtained during the scope of that person's employment or whose professional communications are generally confidential, including an attorney. Now, you can report as anonymously if you choose to do so. I know that there are concerns about our relationships with the clients and how that could be harmful, but we are mandated as attorneys and just as citizens and residents of the state of Texas to report that abuse regardless of whether those communications would otherwise be confidential. It actually is a Class A misdemeanor if you have cause to believe that the elderly person or the person with a disability has been abused, neglected, or exploited and knowingly fails to report. And it's also an offense if you knowingly or intentionally report false information. And those kind of investigations are things that are done through law enforcement. APS does not file reports with law enforcement about failure to report or false reporting, usually particularly false reporting. That's something that we often get complaints about. And just as a matter of practice, APS would rather that you report whether or not you know it's true and have us go out and make that investigation and find out what's going on. So the reporter information is kept confidential. It's not released except without a court order, or when we have to mandate, we're mandated to send that information. So like law enforcement would get the reporter information, and then they should be following that confidentiality and keeping the reporter's information confidential. When we make reports to the probate courts or the courts with probate jurisdiction, they are also entitled to the reporter's information if they would like. But generally, if a client is wanting an investigation about themselves, they're not going to be given the reporter's identity or anything like that. So they'll get the report, what that is, but statewide intake is trained to do those as neutrally as possible. And then our records unit will redact the reporter's identity before that is released, except in those certain cases where the court has ordered it. And also as a note, there are only certain individuals that are entitled to obtain copies of APS records. So we're able to gather a lot of information about medical issues, financial issues, and those are not subject to open records request. They are subject to release only upon entitlement. So think people like the clients entitled to their case records. If they are deceased, the representative of their estate. If they have a guardian, the guardian would be entitled to the records. But if I'm interested and I want to know what happened, to the lady down the street, because I saw a bunch of cars there and I wanted to know if maybe APS had been involved with her, I would not be entitled to her records as somebody completely uninvolved with the case. All right, and so then we do also have some disciplinary rules of professional conduct that apply. For those of you who are lawyers, for everyone else, please bear with us. This part is the part that gets us ethics credit, which we all always want. So attorneys under the rules do have a duty to take reasonable action to secure the appointment of a guardian or other protective orders with respect to a client when the lawyer reasonably believes that the client lacks legal confidence and that such action should be taken to protect the client. So one of these actions that you can take could potentially be a call to Adult Protective Services. We can investigate whether or not the individual, if there's less restrictive alternatives to guardianship or supports and services that are available to help. You can do that in concert with any other actions that you are required to take, such as notifying the court with probate jurisdiction. But this, I would believe that a call to APS definitely falls within this disciplinary rule. Also, those rules state that a lawyer may reveal confidential information when the lawyer has reason to believe it is necessary to do so in order to comply with a court order, a Texas disciplinary rule of professional conduct, or other law. And that other law would include the Chapter 48 requirement to report to APS. All right, clients' rights. So once we've completed the investigation, we move into the real meat and bones of Adult Protective Services. So we can provide services to a vulnerable adult with that person's consent or without that person's consent, only if they lack capacity and meet the conditions in the Human Resources Code 48.208, which is our emergency removal We can also make a referral to Health and Human Services Commission without that individual's consent. But except for those few rare circumstances, which is a very small proportion of the cases that APS investigates and provides services on, those services that APS provides are going to be with the consent of the individual. All right, so a person does lack capacity under the Human Resources Code if, because of a mental or physical impairment, they are incapable of understanding the nature of the services offered and agreeing to receive or reject the protective services. So a slightly different standard than under the Estates Code, much more akin to an ability to give informed consent under the medical procedures. So clients absolutely have the right to refuse to cooperate with the investigation. If they do so, APS has to conduct the investigation as best as they can without the assistance of that individual. They have the right to refuse to allow us to enter their home. As long as they have capacity to consent, they have the ability to refuse, the right to refuse any protective services that APS offers. They have the right to participate in service planning. They have the right to select the least restrictive alternatives that are available to them. And so APS really does work with our clients to make sure that the services that we're providing are things that they want. And it can sometimes be very frustrating to individuals who are involved otherwise, family members, friends, reporters. Why can't APS just force them to go into a nursing home? That's where they want, that's where they should be. That would be best for them. That's not the role of APS. The role of APS is to get in the services that that individual will consent to and that are what they want. So we always want to have them in their home if that's what they want to do. If they want to be in their home, we will help them get the services in place to do that safely. And we'll talk a little bit about what kind of services we have. If APS does have to file a legal action, those clients get a court-appointed attorney ad litem to help them advocate for what they want. The legal actions that we do file, the one that we do most often is an emergency order for protective services. That's done when the individual, there's a threat to their life or physical safety. They refuse to consent to the protective services that are being offered and no one else is available to consent. Such as the surrogate decision maker under the Health and Safety Code. APS can petition the court for a very short time to remove that individual from the dangerous situation and put them in a place of safety while we can come up with a plan to ensure their long-term safety. These other actions, if we need to, we can apply for them and we can make that referral to guardianship through Health and Human Services Commission. So that is a separate agency within the state of Texas. And if APS makes that referral to Health and Human Services Commission, they do their own assessment to determine if the individual is appropriate for their services. And if they do, they will file that application for guardianship. But APS itself does not obtain guardianship. That's all done through a separate agency. As kind of an extra check to make sure that we have more people looking and making sure that there aren't any less restrictive alternatives that are available and appropriate, and that individual's rights are being protected. So as I've said, service delivery is focused on an individual plan that's meant to eliminate or reduce further risk of harm. And so we have some tools that the APS specialists use to identify the problem so that they can help come up with a course of action. Things that APS may do in a standard case, which does not involve me at all as their attorney. They might help find some money management resources. They might set up some provider services, some Meals on Wheels, an emergency response system. There are so many agencies and programs, it's hard for people to know what all of those are. So APS can really be a good resource to help our vulnerable adults know what's out there that may be able to assist them. You know, here locally, what can ACOG do? What resources does ACOG have? What is ACOG? You know, these are things that members of the public don't necessarily know. So APS can come in On a short-term basis, we can help provide some case management and some referrals to these services, these other agencies that can provide long-term assistance. Sometimes APS can assist with home improvements if a ramp or something small is needed to continue living at home safely. They may need assistance providing, purchasing some medications, life-sustaining medications. And then as we've discussed, if there's a immediate client safety issue, we can make an immediate intervention and possibly refer to guardianship. All right, a few of the collaborative efforts and challenges that face APS and our population in general. There can be issues getting food, medications, and other supplies. Resources are not unlimited. We can sometimes assist on an emergency short-term basis with providing those supplies. APS can also assist sometimes with emergency shelter and alternative living arrangements. There's heavy house cleaning, minor home repairs, assistance getting utilities put back on. APS can use our emergency services to get medical and psychiatric assessments, and we are going to help facilitate services provided through other agencies. Like everyone else, there are limitations on what care is available in home and for home health. Those are not things that APS sets up, working through various insurances, either private or through the state. There are certain resources, there's only limited resources for those who are not able to go into long-term care and need to remain in their homes or want to remain in their homes. And then, as always, there are issues with inadequate community services for individuals with mental health diagnoses. A lot of times those individuals overlap with the adult protective services community and population, and there's always a shortage of services. Another thing that happens that's a challenge working with this population that adult protective services faces, as well as the population in general, is there's limited access to preventative and early intervention services for those at risk of abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Unless there's actually some kind of valid finding of abuse, neglect, or exploitation, APS cannot provide any services. There's also a shortage of the specialized geriatric social workers. It's just not keeping up with the population. As we spoke about earlier, there really is, this population is growing. And unfortunately, the specialized resources are not always keeping up with that. All right. And I did mention earlier that APS does work with law enforcement when appropriate. If APS suspects that there may be a crime, we do make that report to law enforcement and send them a copy of our investigation. We work together on investigations as appropriate if the investigations between law enforcement and APS overlap. Law enforcement also assists APS when there's personal safety concerns. But like I know, even though we may work together, APS is doing their investigation and we have certain things that we're looking for, and law enforcement has their investigation. And some of the facts, some of the evidence may overlap, but we really are investigating different things. APS is looking at a preponderance of the evidence. We're really looking to limit the risk of future harm, whereas law enforcement is looking at that beyond a reasonable doubt. So sometimes it can be frustrating when you've got clients who say, well, APS validated against my brother for exploitation, but law enforcement didn't do anything. That may be one of the reasons, is because the standards are different. But we do cooperate, and if you've got a client who is a victim of a crime and you think that the detective could benefit from looking at the APS investigation, and they may not know that there is one, just let the detective know that there has been an APS investigation and they can request our records and review them. All right, and Once again, here is how to report abuse, neglect, and exploitation. It is the same statewide intake as for Child Protective Services. So I highly recommend that you save those to your phone if you can, or if you Google report child abuse Texas or adult abuse Texas, you can get to those contacts. And I believe Byron's going to have this information up in a few minutes, but I did want to make sure to note that if you are seeking CLE, that you'll need to self-report that with the bar. We will not be reporting that. So here's the course number. It'll also be up on the screen a little bit later as Byron is concluding. And this course, this session is approved for 1 hour ethics, so you can claim that. All right, and that is it for now. Do we have any questions?
Lisa, one question is, how can I get a copy of APS records?
All right, so APS on our website, there's actually information on how to request that. Anybody who's involved in the case can submit a form and request those records. So the client, the alleged victim, an alleged perpetrator can request the portion of the case involved with themselves. Or if you need those a little bit faster, you can also subpoena the records. If you contact our records management group, they will let you know who the custodian of the records is for that particular client. And all that information is available on our website.
What type of services are available for the homeless population that meet APS guidelines?
So Adult Protective Services, I'll be honest, I'm not super involved in this, what are the particular services that are available, but we do work with Haven for Hope, and all of our community partners and our specialists are able to communicate with them to see what resources are available with regards to housing or medication management or obtaining medical care. So we do work with the homeless population. Being homeless of itself is not necessarily a grounds for us to seek a court order or a guardianship. We're really going to look again, does that person, what do they need? What services are available? So we really do rely heavily on our community partners to obtain those services. So APS is very familiar with those.
Can a reporting agency get a copy of the APS investigation, or is it better to have law enforcement request records?
It's generally the reporter is not going to be entitled to the record other than the portion that involves themselves, and then we would redact out the reporter information, so that's sometimes not as helpful, whereas law enforcement can get the entire record, including the reporter information, so it's usually going to be more helpful to have law enforcement request those records immediately if they need them. That also eliminates any kind of chain of command issues. Chain of custody, sorry.
Okay, we have one more question. Can APS place someone in their nursing home?
So APS can help facilitate placement in nursing homes. We're not necessarily going to be able to force somebody into a facility against their will. So if that's somebody that wants to be in a nursing home and doesn't know where to start, yes, APS can help with that and help facilitating the placement. If we've got a doctor's office that says that this individual needs, would be better off in a nursing home but doesn't want to go, unless there's that danger, there's that higher risk and we need to get a court order or we need to get a guardianship referral, we're not going to be able to force that individual if they've got capacity and are choosing not to be there. All right, and let's see. I see that we have a hand raised. Oh, it went away. All right. Are there any more questions, or are we going to turn this back over to Byron?
One more question.
Oh.
If I believe another person reports suspected abuse, do I still need to do it?
No, not necessarily. And for y'all as attorneys, if you ever have questions, my cell phone's on there. You can give me a call if you want to know, like, is there already an APS case? Is there an APS investigator assigned to the case? You're more than welcome to email me or give me a call, and I will assist as much as possible. But if you know that there's already an APS case that's been called in and that there's an investigator assigned to the case, a specialist, an APS specialist, then you do not need to call again. We don't need a report from everyone who knows something. If you don't know if there's been a report or not, then yes, please go ahead and call it in.
I think that's all the questions. Oh, wait, here it is. If evidence of financial exploitation, if there's evidence of financial exploitation after the person has died, what can be done?
That's going to be after the individual has passed away. That's going to be beyond the jurisdiction of Adult Protective Services. We can only investigate if there's current abuse, neglect, or exploitation. But there may be a law enforcement issue, or there may be some kind of a state issue that may be handled through the probate courts or through law enforcement. Yes, and I see that I'm back to the question about the self-reporting, if there's already an investigation. If you have additional information, you may not need to do a report, but you may need to contact the APS specialist that's investigating the case if you have additional information that you can share with us to help us complete our investigation.
Okay, so I think we've come to the end. This has been amazing. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think if you can't hear it, everybody's applauding. I just know it.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you to the board for putting on this series. And I'm literally looking forward to the next two presentations.
Well, excellent. And so thank you for reminding us that next Wednesday, October 14th, at this same time, same bat channel, we're going to have Dr. Jason Schiller-Strom, who will be reporting on identifying the vulnerable adult, clinical signs and symptoms of cognitive impairment and elder abuse. A long title to say that he is a local psychiatrist who works very closely with APS and our courts here in Bexar County and actually across the region to help identify those vulnerable adults. So you really don't want to miss that. And then our final one in 2 weeks will be a panel of folks that you absolutely don't want to miss. So, and if your question wasn't answered, please, well, I think we answered all the questions that were posted, but if you have an additional question, you're more than welcome to email Lisa Centeno, who is our liaison to the South Texas APS Community Board, and her email is up. And of course, the CLE course with 1 hour of ethics number is there. And so on behalf of the South Texas APS Board, Community Board, and all of our sponsors, I want to thank again Lisa Diven Brown for presenting, and thank everybody for joining us, and we'll see you guys next week.